Yeah, how do you live in the land of abundance and feel like it's the end of the world?
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
Cameron, a couple amazing things happened in the last few days two of which caught my attention. One is Faith Kipchoge breaking the women's world record in the marathon. So she ran sub 2:10 in the marathon, which is just incredible. Took 2 minutes off the world record. An incredible athletic feat. I thought of that in terms of my grandfather was saying that when he was a kid, his sister was on a basketball team. And so we're talking like 1940s here. And at the time in college, they didn't think that women had the stamina to run full court in basketball. So the women's basketball team had 3 people on offense and 3 people on defense, and they didn't cross the half court line. So you had your defenders who would get the ball and then throw it to the other half of their team because they weren't really sure, whether women were up for full court basketball. And then you have somebody running, 26 miles. It's hilarious. So there you go for progress. That happened. And then the other thing that just is like mind boggling, and if you haven't seen this yet, go watch it, is the SpaceX booster return to the launch pad. Probably the trippiest, most sci-fi looking thing I've seen in a long time. So the rocket launches in a conventional sense. It goes up the first stage booster, separates like it does in every launch. And then it's basically a tube flying backwards and landing upright in the arms of the launch pad. It is a wild, I can't imagine the technological innovation and creativity and skill that went into flying a tube backwards and getting it's 70 meters long, I think, and getting it to perfectly land. So stop what you're doing and go watch that if you haven't seen it, and just sit there for a second, especially if you know anything about physics or aerodynamics or just technology in general. That is a wild thing. But it stood out to me that as you have both of these events happening, those are like really incredible human achievements. Like those are both a world record in a marathon and a flight activity that's never been done before. And it almost stood out as weird to me because we live in such a time of like it seems like the pervasive mood is it's the end of the world as we know it, and we don't feel fine. Little bit of a pun there. So what is it about, like, there are still good things happening in the world, but there's this general haze, I think, particularly in America, which is odd, but and in most of the world, that like things are not good, and people have this sense of chaos. Doom isn't the right word. Just gloominess. Yeah, a haze of gloom seems to be there, and so every once in a while we see kind of these little moments of like, oh yeah, actually humans still are really creative and are good at stuff, and we can do amazing things. How are you seeing the balance of those two things worked out? Is it an equal balance, or is the scale really skewed one direction or the other?
Yeah, so I'm going to draw on some of the talks I've given recently, so just cheating off my own notes.
Yeah, copy off yourself.
We were both at... I'll copy off myself. We were both at a Young Life camp not too long ago, Nathan, and I was talking about this. But so the science fiction writer Alan Roberts asked, I think, two really interesting questions. They were really interesting to me because they would not have occurred to me. But he said, first of all, where are all of our utopian fictions? And then secondly, why has dystopia conquered the world? And so it's really interesting. So 1516, Sir Thomas More writes Utopia, published originally in Latin. Mm-hmm. And then in the wake of that book's publication, there were scores and scores of utopian visions, some of them fictional, some of them legitimate proposals on how we might work together to pursue human flourishing and have a better, utopian society. Now, I think if anybody proposes that, people would probably sneer at you. So I just kind of took it for granted that if there's a movie about the future, let's say there's a movie or there's a new show on Amazon Prime or Netflix or wherever you get your whatever streaming service you subscribe to, if there's a new show about the future, what do you assume it's going to be like? Is it going to be, it's about how we're forging ahead and making. Now, the last show that really did that in earnest, I think, was Star Trek. Plenty of people have pointed out Star Trek was a utopian. Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, and it was a utopian. Now they had to do battles across the galaxy with various nefarious aliens and all of that, but it was a picture of us boldly going where no man or person has gone before. That's all changed now. And I didn't realize this. So he says, why is utopia such a late comer as well? That was actually his second question. I misspoke. His first was why, where are all of our utopian visions, and why does utopia show up so late? Utopia shows up later. It shows, so 1868 was when John Stuart Mill, the political philosopher, coined that term. He was talking about the repressive government in Ireland, and he said they are creating not a utopia, but a dystopia. And then I think it was 1890. I can double check that on my smartphone here in a second. But when H.G. Wells published his novel The Sleeper Awakes, which is the first, according to Alan Roberts, full-blown dystopian story where you have all the tropes of dystopia, a repressive future with tyrannical leadership and people crushed by that. But so it's a modern development, this line of thinking. And then H.G. Wells did it again with the time machine, because if you remember the time machine, when he goes forward, it's not a very sunny future with humanity being devoured by Morlocks and
Well, two things real quick. One is I said the wrong runner's name, so there's an element of dystopia. She was a famous runner, but she's not the one who. It's Ruth is the name of the lady who broke the marathon world record. So, goodness, get my facts straight. Impressive, no matter what she's named. The second one is, though, let me slow down there a second, because you have your secular utopia, and there's a bit of a play on words here, because depending on how you pronounce your Greek introductions here, you could have utopia, which is no place, or utopia, which is good, good place.
Yeah.
No place or good place. Yeah. But there's a religious version of this that I think is more well developed. So even if you look at the founding of America in kind of a Puritan Protestant vision of a new Israel or a new Jerusalem,
right.
So religion maintains the concept of a utopia. What we're talking about here is a secular, collective, cultural kind of analysis of human achievement. Can say something about separating those two things out, because I think that's an important. I am a utopian, actually.
Yeah, well,
but not now. And I don't think Elon Musk is going to be the one who brings it.
That has to do with the eschatological horizon of your hope as a Christian, which is rooted in Christ and his kingdom and a new heavens and a new earth. So that doesn't mean, of course, that you and I, as Christians, don't want to be about our King's business here and now. We do, and it doesn't mean that we're not responsible citizens. We are, and we care, and we're invested. But it changes the shape of our expectations, for sure, right?
Well, we have a longer runway
on a secular.
We have a bigger airstrip, and so we can land bigger planes. We play in a bigger field. Our horses have more freedom and room to run, and so the way in which we feel like we're situated is going to be, by definition, more flexible and more free, just in the way in which it feels, if nothing else.
And we operate in an open system, so we have help from above as well, as opposed to being rational people in control of our destiny, or under the illusion that we're in control of our destiny and thinking that we have to solve every problem and that the world is necessarily on our shoulders. So those are two very different mindsets. Let me complicate this though for a second, because you talked about there is a kind of heavenly utopian vision that characterizes the American imagination. And that is tied, we don't have time in this particular podcast to go into all the details of that, but it is tied to a very particular theological vision that some of the Puritans imported. But basically, some Americans have inherited as a default position a kind of millennial hope that is concentrated really on America as the prime site of God's kingdom. And this is where the famous Winthrop sermon about America being a city on, seen as a city on a hill. Now it's worth nuancing that a little bit. So when John Winthrop preached that sermon, he wasn't necessarily just saying we are that great city on a hill. Part of what he was a little bit, it's true. Part of what he was also doing, though, was he was trying to say this great American experiment is unfolding right now. History is in the making right now, and the eyes of the world are on us as a nation. So he was also drawing attention to the fact that everybody was watching and everybody wanted to see how will this experiment unfold.
Okay.
So I just want to put that in there too.
But let's run with that, because the deepest of moments of despair come from unmet expectation. So if you start,
that's why I'm bringing this up.
If you start with the expectation as a nation that we are going to grow this into something that is perpetually and continuously expansively awesome, it's like having a
many of the later
basketball.
People.
Yeah, it's like line up and you have this,
some of the later, not John Winthrop.
No, go ahead, finish that side.
Well, I mean, some of John Winthrop was relatively restrained in his sermon, but some of the later sermons, by the way, many of them are documented in James Davison Hunter's new book, Democracy and Solidarity, were completely unrestrained, basically painting a full-blown heavenly vision of America and saying to their congregations, these ministers were basically saying, this is what this heavenly vision will unfold here, but so you need to get out there and you have to be moral, because this is what is to be our land. So you have to go out and do this now. And you have to see this vision realized in your own society. So yeah, think about that. Now, imagine proposing now there are people who still, there's vestigial traces of this still, Nathan. I mean, I've talked with people who still think along these lines, but by and large, if you tried to say this to in any kind of secular or elite setting, you wouldn't just meet with mockery and derision. You'd be seen as seriously dangerous. But so the ways in which, so we're seeing a vision that was once really vital that is now completely depleted. That vision has it's lost its luster for most of our elite. So yeah, let's talk about that a bit.
Let me balance something out here. So I was saying it's like kind of like shooting a basketball and having your shot blocked. Like you had a vision of where this thing was going, and then well, bam, like somebody says no. That being said, what we have achieved as America is phenomenal. So this goes back to launching lockets and breaking world records in marathons. Is that there is a lot of beauty and good and progress and development that's happening here, but we're not building heaven on earth through it. So I guess it comes to like where your level of expectation is dependent on how the depth of the despair that you will sense, even in the midst of what by any global metric or any historical metric is a phenomenal time of prosperity. If you're living in the United States of America,
yes,
in 2024, oh my goodness, like you're living in a society that is unfathomable in its abundance, seemingly, I dare I say, across the entire history of the experience of humanity. So what I'm grappling with is, how do you live in that and feel like it's the end of the world? That's the question we need to be asking ourselves.
Yeah, how do you live in the land of abundance and feel like it's the end of the world? Well, I don't have the answers here, and I know you don't either, Nathan. We'll very much kind of trying to just work through this together in a constructive way. I want to throw in a couple of just considerations. So I think a very wise book that came out, I think originally in 1966, maybe it was 63, was Frank Kermode's The Sense of an Ending. And I mean, it's been in print ever since. He wrote a new introduction to that book in 2000. Frank Kermode has since passed away. I think he was in his 90s or something like that. Very esteemed literary critic at Oxford. But he was not a Christian. had a lot of respect for the scriptures. Obviously, as a professor of literature, you wouldn't really expect anything less. But he said a couple of things. First of all, he argued, and he looked at stories, and his arguments are in that book are actually quite subtle. So it's not a long book, but it's a hefty book, if you know what I mean. So I can't possibly do full justice here. But one of the things he says is, it seems to be the case that we need a firm ending to make sense of our lives. And in the past, an apocalyptic kind of ending served that function very well. It offered a kind of a fitting end. It offered a sort of telos, an orientation for people. And even when it was a fearful prospect, and he talks about times in the past. So one really interesting thing about that book that he talks about in the new introduction is that when he initially delivered those lectures, a lot of people said, well, in the past, folks didn't have to worry about nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. So their fears of the end were relatively superficial compared to ours. And Frank Kermode, vehemently disagreed with that. He said, no, they may not have had nuclear weapons, but they had wars and rumors of wars and vast plagues. And there were times, and you can look in the history books, you can look at different church leaders where they were completely and fully convinced of Christ's imminent return, and there was terror about it, terror of being found, not being able to stand in the last judgment. And yeah, there were varying levels of superstition that played into this as well. But his point was, no, there was the feel of an existential threat to humanity, capital H, is a historical fact that goes down the ages, and you don't need nuclear weapons to have it. So that fear is perennial, and that sense sometimes. But he also points out that a lot of time you will go through history and people will say, well, these. He pulls a whole bunch of those quotes from a lot of older voices saying, that we're really at a time now where it's so dark and it's so bleak. I don't see how the world can continue any longer. So people have been saying that for a long time. They're saying it now. And now people will say, well, yeah, but something feels different today. And I don't know, Nathan, here's a little aside. I don't know that people necessarily outside the West are saying that. I know a lot more people in the West are saying that, because certainly it feels like Western civilization writ large has reached a point of exhaustion.
Okay.
And that we feel we've come to the end of our resources. But yeah, I've said way too much there.
Well, I want to get you to keep talking on something, because you talk to somebody who is half of your age who has a different perspective. Can you say something a little bit about how you think generational, and this is how we're thinking about the generationally right now?
Yeah. Yeah. And this is kind of anecdotal because this just goes to personal conversations, but yeah, so I've had conversations with one I'm thinking of in particular. This person's in their 20s and their outlook is pretty sunny, actually. Now, we might say, oh, well, that's because they haven't lived long enough to see how bad things really are. And that, that sunny disposition will soon vanish. Yeah, but in a sense, isn't that true of almost everybody? I'm talking this way. I've just recently turned 40. And so now I have had a little experience under my belt. I've seen how life how it can go, how things can fall apart and go wrong. And so now my perspective is necessarily a little bit more dark. Yeah, but I think also he thinks, no, I've got energy and there are people there. Yeah, we're facing challenges, but there are solutions to those challenges. We're up for meeting them and we can do that. That seems to be a kind of long-standing dynamic between the generations down the ages, at least in my own observation. And if you look at the history books, this is that kind of conversation happens all the time. There's a sort of dialectic that plays out where you've got older people who's basically are also nearing their death. This is another argument that Kermode makes. The older we get, the closer we get to the grave, we have this distinct tendency to think, well, the world's ending. And his kind of gentle rebuke there is, your world might be ending, but not everybody else's world is ending. But it's true. We actually do have a tendency to do that. We think the whole universe revolves around us. So then when our strength is waning, our powers are waning, we tend to think, well, it's all just going, isn't it?
So I want to get back
I'm
to your
explaining
idea
some of this away.
of the need of a sense of an end. So there's our own end, there's our country's end, and there's the world's end. And maybe people kind of jump across those categories subconsciously in their mind as they're working that out. But there is a little bit of value in thinking through, like, if you didn't know what time your workday ended, how would that influence your work? That having clarity on the end does do something to help motivate or steer or guide how you want to use your remaining time. All of us have
Yep.
experienced this of having, hey, write this paper. When's it due? I don't know, whenever. Or it's due 10 days from now. Those are very different felt experiences in how we want to engage with what we need to, do. So the sense of an ending is important.
Mm-hmm.
And here's where I think Christianity can really help, or it's been my experience. And so, okay, I'm younger than Cameron, but I get to hang out with a bunch of people who are like significantly older than me, and it's a lot of fun. And I see people full of life in their later decades, like energy, excitement, who are obviously certainly sure that they're going to die soon. But if dying soon isn't like a threat exactly, then it lets you squeeze a lot of pleasure out of the last quarter of your life. And so I hang out with the people who say, being 90 is more fun than being 18. That's weird, right? But I think in a beautiful way.
Well, you're making me think of something interesting here. And I wasn't planning on going here. But our addiction to safety these days, I think, may be playing a role in our perception of everything ending. Because I think it's become apparent in recent years. So if just hang with me for 2 seconds here. If modernity hinges on, I mean, however you define it, many, forests have given their lives to trying to answer that, how you define modernity. But surely one way of saying it would be that it centers on on control, on humanity being in control. And what's happened in recent decades is we have had confirmed over and over again that we are not in control, even when we are at our most technologically sophisticated, even when we have some of our greatest breakthroughs, even when we have some of our best minds working together on the biggest projects. We still are the old human vulnerabilities still are true. So if you're a Christian and you have a realistic anthropology, that poses no threat to you. If you're animated by a secular kind of humanism where you thought at one point that we were perfectible, or that we could reach a new era of reason and peace, then it's hard to escape a sense of deep disillusionment. And now, when we've been you talked about our affluence, we've been so comfortable, but that has come with another cost, where we've become, this is Peter Kraft speaking, not me, we're all wusses. We're all wusses. We're all terrified of pain, and we're all terrified of death. And in the past, Dallas Willard talks about the terrible scourge of the fear of death, which is something that he says is absent from mature Christians. Now, I want to say that with compassion. I'm not saying I'm not speaking with any authority here. I fear death as much as the next person, but I was talking with my mom about this recently. One of the phrases that I've come to really loathe of our age is "stay safe," as though the highest good is that you are safe from physical and emotional harm. But our world, of course, is filled with, there will be another massive storm. I hate to say it, but there will be more storms, there will be more floods, there will be more homes and villages and towns swept away in our world history. There will be more wars and bloodshed. And that's not pessimism, that's just realism about a fallen world and a fallen condition of humanity. And so if we recognize, so much of this hinges on expectation, doesn't it, Nathan?
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Your expectations,
But here's the thing, Cameron, is I think what's happening here is we've had phenomenal development technologically in the categories that technology can speak to, but technology does not speak to the categories of meaning. And so it's weird for us to think that we can land a rocket backwards, but we're still afraid to die. So you have something that, 15 years ago is unthinkable, and then you're throwing that up against, and we've solved that, but now we're throwing that up against for the entire existence of humanity. What happens when we die? Question. So our progress is not in the categories in which and this is why science will never replace religion, by the way, is because it's technologically answering questions that are important for our well-being, but not significant for our conception of meaning and morality. So if you can separate out what's what there, but then throw in here just one other thing is that, so New York Times this morning has an article, have we reached peak human lifespan? And looking at, like, actually, scientifically speaking, we're kind of getting on the cusp of, a lot of people are thinking, we're going to kind of peak out on average life expectancy for men around 84 and women at 90, given an average of 87. And sure, we've had phenomenal increases in that number up until recently, but we've kind of plateaued.
Which is great, by the way.
Oh, yeah. But then there are still people, like, there are bets out there of, like, somebody will be, 120, 150. I remember, so 11 years ago when my daughter was born, her great grandfather got a life insurance policy for it, and it, the term limit was 121 years. And they said, in the next 80 years, by the time she's 80 years old, think of the technology that'll have been developed to extend life for another 40 years. But here's the thing, is that a lot of this is very cloistered in small categories of thought. And that if you go read the comments on that New York Times article about peak humanity and whether or not we can extend human life, you're going to hear from a whole lot of chaplains and hospice care nurses who say, do you know what that last 40 years of life is going to look like if you live to be 150? That's you sitting there with a feeding tube, drooling on yourself, staring at the wall with dementia. And so by and large, like, we get some of this technological idealism of what's possible, and then the people who are, like, actually really living life are saying, yeah, but even technology isn't providing us of a vision of something that, if we could do it, that we would want to do. So therein, I think, lies the rub of we're taking our technological optimism and then trying to use that to solve our psychological pessimism. And those are two separate categories, and it doesn't work like that unless you come back to some sort of religious framing, which we do as Christians, that sees death as a problem not to be solved, but that has been solved. And then suddenly we're free to play. We build bridges across those different avenues, and we play in the world. So that's my thesis on how this feels anyway.
So I think what we've said so far, just to give you some tangible stuff to hold on to as you think through this, is, first of all, that there's the pain of unmet expectations, which is huge. And there were high hopes for, at one point, a heavenly vision in America, and some people still hold on to that. There were high hopes on a secular front for a perfectible humanity. Both of those have not been met in major ways and have caused a lot of disillusionment, cynicism, and pain. But then there is also the other major factor, and we don't really need to discuss this on this particular podcast. We talk about it a lot, but we are facing a huge cultural and political crisis, not just in the United States, but in the West right now. There is a growing recognition from political theorists, sociologists, cultural critics. There's a massive convergence of voices who have been saying for a long time the resources of our cultural and political resources are nearly depleted, if not fully, if not approaching a place of total depletion in America, certainly, and in the West. And this is why so what does that mean? In the general mood, it means that a lot of people don't look at the future with dread, rather than with a sense of expectation and excitement, which is a healthy response. A healthy response is to say, yeah, I expect good things in the future. An unhealthy response is to say, oh, I'm terrified to think about tomorrow. I'm terrified to think about the world my children will live in. And I think more and more people feel that way because there's a gradual recognition that, yeah, we have rockets that can go backwards and lots of improving technologies and all that, but things are not getting better. The quality of life for people is not getting better. And there are also, by the way, Nathan, plenty of young people who do think that too. I had that one conversation, but it needs to be pointed out that the numbers are not encouraging with the mindset of young people who are experiencing terrible depression and anxiety. You have, I think the phrase death by despair is extremely haunting, but helpful. And that refers to people who are everybody from somebody who's overdosed to somebody who's committed suicide. Death by despair are up. So the mood is dark right now. The mood's been dark in the past as well. That does happen from time to time, but that's real, and we should acknowledge that. And certainly, we are in a place of real cultural and political crisis. You see the rise of authoritarianism trends, both on the left and on the right. And again, we keep doing this. The book that we're drawing on quite a bit here is James Davison Hunter's Democracy and Solidarity, which makes a lot of these same points, but he's not the only one doing that. And so that's not to say that it's all falling apart. That's just to say that the mood is dark because there are real things that are falling apart. That is happening, and that is real. Okay. Doesn't mean things are completely bleak, but yeah.
So two thoughts. So one of these is, though, that the danger is that desperation is not a strategy, it's a response. So when people have a vision that they think they're losing, they start doing things out of desperation that usually are not wise. So there's that element. The other heartbreaking element of this, I think it was the New York Times. Can't remember the article. I have to look it up. Anyway, it said that 53% of young liberal-leaning white women in America, 53%, have a diagnosed mental health condition. That's over half. No, we can talk about mental health and all that. Yeah. But I'm saying when you have a category of the population that probably is the most affluent, that now, and I just I don't even comment on everything that I think is going on there. Instead of having people who are like, hey, here's a challenge, let's figure out how to solve it. You have people with something is wrong with me and the world. And it just feels backwards to me on the way that I'm oriented toward the world out of just the way that I see reality. In my experience, I've shared this before. When my daughter was born and I caught her coming into the world, the first thing I said to her was, welcome to the world. I have so many amazing things to show you. So that's a statement of optimism. My kids all the time ask me questions that actually no human has answered yet about how stuff works or what, I'm like, this is great. We don't know. But I always say, you know what? Someday maybe you'll figure that out. And won't that be exciting when you do? So I am, oddly enough, postured in this world as a Christian with a deep pessimism that our internal resources will build utopia here, with a deep confidence and hope in Christ redeeming and renewing and making all things new. And then based on that, having a retroactive optimism about the human capacity and experience to steward our Father's world well and to develop and build and create and change all in helpful and healthy ways. So I have this kind of I don't think humans have the resources. I think God does. I think God's involved in the lives of humans. Therefore, I think the future looks good to me. But the future doesn't look good for us if we start with humanity. But if we start with God, then the future looks good for humanity. So it's a little bit of I'm not talking pie in the sky here all by and by. I'm saying I believe in a future new heavens and new earth for sure. I believe that the knowledge of that gives me a deep joy and stability in the way that I live now. To quote Grandpa again here, he always says, you have to accept the reality of death, but don't die until you do. And what he means by that is a lot of people who hit 70 and are like, well, I'm basically dead, and then just sit around for 18 years. So I think you're pushing that number back farther now to 17-year-olds who say, I'm going to die. What's the point of being motivated to do anything? And I would say, as a Christian, if your biggest problems in life are already sorted out, then suddenly a lot of those parameters and boundaries have been removed, and you have a phenomenal amount of freedom to play in your Father's world and to sort things out and to figure and be a responsible person, not just in a relationship with God, but with other people, and to do stuff with God's physical earth that he delights in showing us. it's an entirely different way to wake up in the morning. And I think there's a deep sustainability and stability that comes from that, because we don't have to look at the news in order to kind of check the market value of human creativity every morning in order to know how I'm going to feel about the future. So I've outsourced my optimism, I guess, into a point that is stable outside of human control. And then that gives me a deep hope for the possibilities of what God is able to do in the world through people who are willing to be used by him. That might sound like a convoluted, it's more simple in my mind. I explained it in a more complicated way, but I think that really has been the Christian experience throughout the ages that's led to the development of some really wonderful things. That's my thesis. We can argue about it later.
Yeah,
but
well said.
That's where I'm sitting these days.
Well said. Consider outsourcing your optimism to the Lord of all creation. It's in safe hands there. I like that. That's a soundbite I can get behind. Hope this has been helpful to you. Hope we've gotten the wheels turning. Just keep thinking along these topics with us. We appreciate it. We value your thoughts as well. Consider weighing in on TOL Connect, where you can set us straight and help us in our thinking. But you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.